Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. With me today is Alisa Mick, founder of MiXi, a nonprofit organization for accelerating the transition towards a circular economy. Welcome, Alisa.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So why don't we just start off with the basics? Circular economy. How do we look at that? What is that?
So the simple kind of definition of circular economy is a way of thinking of everything that we do, we produce, we consume, with the idea that we need to use the resources that we have as much as possible and then take as less as possible virgin materials. So I always say the circular economy is a bit difficult to understand because it's not a sector or an industry. It's relevant for all the industries that we have and all the stages in the supply chain. I relate to that as a kind of a revolution in the way that we think about economy, which of course is the kind of the linear economy that we have now.
Right. So, I mean, maybe a simple example too, because we're going to talk about sustainable cities. I mean, talk about Helsinki. As I said, I came back from Copenhagen, which is the city of bikes.
Yeah.
And, in terms of cutting down on carbon output and certain industries that may be contributing negatively to our environment, that is a city, to my understanding, that's doing some wonderful things. Is that the same in Helsinki?
Yes, so of course the Nordic countries generally are quite advanced in promoting sustainability and circularity. So for example, Finland was the first country in the world to create a roadmap towards circular economy. And the World Circular Economy Forum was initiated by an organization called Sitra, which is the innovation fund here in Finland, and their yearly event is taking place in different countries every year. So, for example, in 2025, it will be in Brazil. These countries have been the first to kind of pave journey towards that circular and sustainable future. Many other European countries have joined. So, of course, also today, the Netherlands are very advanced in circular economy. There are some who would say much advanced than Finland, for example. Also, France are doing great things. I always say about Finland is that nature is part of the way of life here. So if there are countries where you can think about economy and nature as separate things, here they're part of the kind of everyday life, and for many companies also something they consider. Of course, there are many things that we still need to improve because, as we know, we have very ambitious goals, but in practice, sometimes in these countries, our consumption habits are not so sustainable. So what I see in the I can say, last years is that the discussions are more turning into speaking about regeneration and restoration. So how to bring nature to be part of the way we live and the way we operate our businesses. So in that sense, I'm lucky to be in a country where it's one of the priorities.
So do you think that maybe the question is, why do you think that the social conscience, not just of Finland, but the Nordic countries, seems to be so different and so advanced in many ways? And I know we're talking about sustainability, but when you look at education, when you look at lower dropout rates, when you look at support for students, for the elderly, there's a very, very different cultural mindset throughout the Nordic countries. I mean, why? What are we missing in the rest of the world?
I think that it's a region where the problems that we have, the challenges that we have, are different than in other regions in the world. We've had the resources, of course, to put also in these areas related to equality, to education. It's one of the only countries in the world where you have still clean air, clean water. We have enough water. It's not a problem. So when you have the basic things, of course, then you can also invest in other areas in the society that you can promote, like, of course, education. in the last years, maybe, you know, the things that have been happening also in Europe, they've been affecting, of course, also this area. So you see also the change. So if in a few years ago, kind of the discussions have been focusing more on climate, so you see also that it has changed, of course, in the last, let's say, 2 years, also to discuss things that are related to, you know, security and these things, but still, education, of course, and areas related to climate are still very high in the priority of the government here.
So what do you think it would take then to roll out some of this thinking, this concern about climate to other cities? I mean, you just mentioned government. Is that the open door or closed door that we have to get through in other countries?
I think, like with other changes, it requires the public sector and the private sector to collaborate. So what I think has been kind of missing maybe in countries like Finland is the involvement of the business sector in the circular economy. This kind of movement and discussions have been initiated by the public sector, like the organization I mentioned before, Citra. They've been doing amazing work. They've been creating different frameworks and playbooks and a lot of research related to these areas. But as we know, when the business sector is involved, when you have more understanding about the financial benefits that these changes bring, so then things start to move. And in fact, this is also the reason why I founded MiXi, because in MiXi we are quite a lot focused on we work with the public sector, but we are focused on the business sector and mainly on startups. Going back to a question, is it definitely an effort that needs to be initiated by the government with different legislations and regulations related to these areas, but you need also the business sector to come and push the things forward.
So one of the things that you say, and we can talk more about MiXi and its purpose, but you say the goal of MiXi is to impact the creation, growth, and adoption of circular economy-related solutions by initiating action-oriented opportunities for collaboration, innovation, and learning. How hard is collaboration? I mean, you did mention the private sector and the profit motive. How do you engage them, and how do they see the profit motive or the impact on profit as actually being positive?
So the thing with circular economy is that it has been considered as something that is nice to have, and something that is more in this world of environment and climate, and that the impact, if you become more circular, you probably need to invest financial resources in order to be more green or more environmental friendly. But the approach that we need to adopt, and that's where we need the collaboration and also the help from the governments with incentives and different regulations, is that it's also more financial to be circular. Because of course, if you use and maximize the resources that you have, then it's also economically better. But it requires an effort from companies, because of course you have this phase of transition. If the production, manufacturing, everything has been according to the linear system, and you need to change, it requires investments of time and money in order to change into the circular economy, which then after some time, then you'll get to see the impact of the change, and also financially. So we are now in this transition phase where companies are trying to become more circular in different ways. You have the regulation coming from the EU, which is pushing this by offering different incentives, but also with different regulation. I can also, of course, elaborate about this. But so you see this change coming, and you see more and more of these use cases where companies that have been adopting circular practices are growing and are benefiting also financially. So eventually, we hope and we see that more companies are joining this transition.
So are there specifics that companies or their CEOs or boards are seeing that impact them positively? And I guess what I mean is, I hear a lot about it's good for the company's bottom line. How and why? Are there this maybe a top 1, 2, 3 reasons that you do get a positive impact?
Well, I think it depends. There is something that is called born circular, which means that there are companies which from day one, they choose a circular business model. So for example, if you have a company that's refurbishing phones, which is a very concrete example, because we have one of the kind of biggest companies in circular economy here in Finland is Swappy, which is refurbishing phones, iPhones. These companies have kind of seen an opportunity where many other companies haven't seen. They've seen that there is a lot of resources out there, products that are not in use, and we can bring them back to the loop, as we call it in circular economy, so back into use. So of course they have had their challenges, because you need to change the market, you need to change the consumption habits of people, that it's okay to buy something that is not new. And we have a lot of these, of course, companies that are providing this kind of circular business model. So it can be refurbishing, but it can be, of course, resale, which is also very popular, of course, as we know, with the secondhand different platforms. But we see also more and more these companies that provide repair and rental services. So this is kind of one role that I would say of these companies that, as I mentioned, are born circular, and then the market is growing. But then, of course, you see more and more companies that have been traditionally doing things in the linear system, as all of us, and they've been trying to adopt, for example, models that are, for example, product as a service. While they have still the linear way of doing things, they've been trying, for example, Philips, they have been collaborating with a company that provides something that's called light as a service. So instead of replacing the light bulbs in companies, they've taken these bulbs, they repair them, and then they put them back into use. So you see more and more of these. Sometimes they are more like in pilot phase, that companies are trying to pilot some kind of circular business model. Then they, of course, they can see if it works or not. But more and more of these kinds of initiatives, that again, as I mentioned, it takes time until they bring profit. But that's the advantage, is that if you are already an established company and you have, of course, the resources to put into this kind of initiatives and pilots, so then you can see also the economical impact of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned also, I mean, when you're talking about that, you're talking about different sectors of the economies that build. You're talking about obviously building an empathy for or helping the customer, the consumer, build an empathy for the climate through accepting refurbishment or reused, or I mean, used clothing has become vintage clothing. I think, which are all wonderful things, but you also take a look behind the scenes, and you talk about supply chains, integrating digital solutions, logistics, ops. That involves so many individuals within a company and outside of it. How do you even begin the process of harnessing 5, 6, 7, 8 players?
So it needs to start from the top executive team. And I think it's also something that we see that is changing, at least in Europe, because we've had this phase that companies understood, okay, we need to have a sustainability manager, for example, but usually it has been a junior position in many companies. They haven't been sitting into the table of the decision makers. So now you see more and more the understanding of companies that these decisions are not only relevant for the sustainability department, and not only relevant for maybe the marketing of the company, to create a kind of more like green brand or something. And the reason is again that on one hand, it's as you mentioned, because it touches all the supply chain, and you need all the relevant people in the company to be involved, and also because it's a long-term decision. So it needs to be a strategic decision, and the company needs to, of course, to plan for the next 3 years where they would like to be in a few years. And it can be because they understand that that's a better way to go, or maybe because the regulation is forcing them. So if in 5 years they won't be there will be in a problem. It's a strategic decision, and of course, then this strategic decision needs to be implemented in all of the relevant departments. What is also coming here in Europe is that it's not only about your company, but it's also about your suppliers. So when you report about your sustainable actions, it means that also your suppliers and that you've been using in order to create a product or a service are also sustainable. So it requires even to kind of understand even better from where are your products coming, which is producing them. In that sense, it also, of course, is relevant for more and more parts of the organization.
And it almost seems that partner countries are critical. I mean, we see the Paris Accord, which seems to have turned into more of a mild suggestion for some countries. So I would guess on that political level, who we partner with, who we develop our supply chains from becomes critical. Because if the two countries aren't aligned in the outcome, it's very hard to create change.
Definitely. And companies that would like to sell their products in Europe, if they're not from Europe originally, it's going to be a challenge for them because, for example, there is the Green Claims Directive coming into force here in Europe, which means that you can't anymore brand your product as green or vegan or ecological if you can't show an evidence that that's kind of what it is. So it's relevant to the product, but also for the packaging, for example. So if you're a company that is not in Europe and you would like to sell a product in Europe, you have these false claims, of course. And another thing is, of course, that one of the goals of the EU with all these regulations is to be much more local. So in circular economy, one of the things is that the production is local as possible in order, again, the loops to be smaller as possible. There's also now the question if before partnering with countries that haven't been in the EU or close to the EU, there has been even an advantage sometimes to partner with countries that are quite far. So that would also change. So you see already that, we had this phase that manufacturing was in Europe, then it changed and was in other countries. So now you see that it's coming back to Europe. So it's quite a big change.
Globalization is being challenged.
Exactly. Yes.
When massive changes come about, and it takes a long time. And I'm not saying this negatively, it just takes a long time for government to act or enact, and it takes a long time for major companies to change things. And again, not saying that negatively, they're large. There are things that they need to go through and standards that they need to upkeep. So what I generally see in those cases is the rise of the startup and the entrepreneurs, the innovators. Is that something that's playing hard in the circular economy?
Yes. Because again, it's you see more and more of these circular business models, like I mentioned, like resale and repair and all these. So of course, it's much easier for a company that is new to start to offer these solutions, and then to offer this solution for corporates instead of corporates starting to develop these solutions in-house. So you see more and more of these circular startups, as we call them, and with different developments that are happening. Of course, some of them are technological, like the digital product passport. I don't know how much it's discussed in Canada, but here in Europe, it's going to change the supply chain.
What is that exactly? Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I know.
Yeah, so the digital product passport is a digital ID that is for each product, but also for the of course, it depends on the level of the what kind of product it is, but you'll be able to trace the product along the supply chain. So it will have the data about the origins of the product, where has it been made, from what kind of materials, and then also to trace it along the supply chain. It is enabled by different technological developments, such as blockchain, for example, that enable this kind of traceability. But what is interesting is that you'll be able then also to trace the product, if it's resold, or if it's repaired, or even recycled eventually. So you'll have data about the journey of the product until the end of life of it. So this brings new opportunities for startups, because you need startups to provide solutions to manage the data, to trace the data, to enable different companies to discuss with each other, because eventually they'll need to have the same language in order to this DPP to be enabled to take the data from different sources. So a lot of new opportunities for these kind of startups, and then we still don't know exactly what would it mean for startups that are in this world of AI and machine learning, because it's really it will require a new understanding of the journey of products along the supply chain.
It sounds, especially when you're building on blockchain, it sounds like the consumer is going to have unbelievable power, and insight and knowledge with which to demand certain things of the products or services that they use. That's so two major changes. I mean, globalization, I won't say to localization, but maybe to regionalization, and a shift in power back to the consumer, the people spending, and the consumer can be the B2B consumer too. So pretty fascinating in those ways. How do we push them to shift towards more sustainable consumption?
I'll tell it like I say that there are 3 C's in this kind of related to more sustainable consumption. So one is to care more. So I think that for many consumers, for many people, let's say, for us, it's very easy to understand that companies, especially big companies, they have an impact on the environment and society. But eventually, many think that us as individual consumers, we can't really change the system as it is. So that's kind of a shift that we need to do, of course, that we have an impact, and we have a negative impact and positive impact. So of course, if we understand better, what does it mean that a product is produced in our region or in very, very far? What does it mean if the cotton is organic or not organic? So kind of to educate ourselves, and of course of the younger generations, because if we had kids, then we're also responsible for their consumption habits. So kind of just to care more and educate ourselves to learn what does it mean, these different, and it's challenging, because there is so much data today that sometimes it's overwhelming. What does it mean to be more sustainable? Then the other thing is to consume less, which is quite difficult for most of us in countries, also in the Nordic countries. That's one of our problems. We consume too much. There is this quote that the most sustainable product is the one that you already have. So that's a shift in kind of the way that we are used to think about things, that, okay, to question ourselves, is it something that is really needed, or can I use what I have, or can I maybe use the shared economy, for example? For example, in our building, I'm living in the center of Helsinki. We have a shared laundry room. So we are using it like the same laundry room as our neighbors. It can be challenging for us maybe to do. Of course, it's easier if I don't need to look if someone else is using the washing machine, but it's more sustainable. So just to consume less. And then the last one is to choose better. So if we have 2 options a product. Of course, then the pricing is coming into also something that we need to consider. But in countries like Finland, many people, they can choose between something that might be a bit more expensive and sometimes not even more expensive, just more sustainable, and between another option which is less sustainable. So to think about our decisions in a different way. So again, if we have a secondhand or something that is new, so maybe we can use the secondhand. So and it's a process, of course, but it's a must if we want to change the way that we live.
The one challenge I hear, though, is the cost factor still. Mm-hmm. When I look at, and it's a global phenomenon. I mean, if you listen to each country's news, you would think that inflation was a result of their specific government, but it's not. It's been a global phenomenon coming out of the pandemic. With all the release of funds out there. It's expensive to live. Interest rates have gone up. Inflation has hit people. Buying patterns of electric vehicles have shifted down tremendously because the cost is here. I mean, it can be tens of thousands of dollars for a more basic of the vehicles. Is it realistic? Like, are we asking consumers too much? Do we need to give them the first one or two things that they could do differently, like have one car or not a second car, if you will, in families, use a shared service? Because I feel sometimes we just tell people what they need to be doing, but when they're trying to buy groceries, in many cases, because of plutocracy, that it just, I don't think that's a fair strategy or ask.
Yeah, but I think that's why the circular economy makes sense, because eventually, of course, it's cheaper to buy secondhand than something new. So in that sense, the kind of the financial situation that we have now should push the circular economy forward, but we definitely need to make these options more accessible, because if it requires us to travel to the other side of the city to repair something, so we won't do that, we'll buy new. So that's one thing that we need to make these more sustainable options more accessible for people. The other thing is and I mentioned France before. I think that France is doing amazing things with pushing circular practices to be part of the daily life of consumers. For example, they've had this, and still have, I think, this kind of vouchers that you get as a consumer for repairing something. So if you want to repair your jacket or whatever, you have a €5 voucher that you go then into the seamstress to repair that. And then, of course, you have this win-win, because you get your repair jacket, but then those small businesses that provide these solutions, they get, of course, customers. So you need to, again, it's an incentive that helps people to understand that this way of living is an option and not something that requires too much effort. Just again, awareness that it's a way of life that is possible. So I think that's the kind of main thing.
Yeah, no, I love what you just described, because the incentive, again, as I had asked about, it's very focused. It's on repair.
Exactly.
And if incentive, goes to reuse, like some of the online clothing, again, it's become vintage, it's become in demand. There's a lot of ways I guess we can do it, but again, it's super focused, which is important, because some of the blanket statements, I mean, you can't reuse food, you can't repair food. So I love that again, you're giving specific practices where you can support consumers, because I think it's just human nature. It's like, okay, go do this.
Yes,
and
exactly.
you have 8 billion people. Go do what?
Yeah. And they also provide, like, they have different types of vouchers. So of course, if it's an electronic device, so €5 won't be probably an incentive really. So I think it's like 50 if you go and repair your phone or some kind of machine. So and I think in that sense, governments need to be a bit more maybe creative, and to take more risks, and to be more brave in their decisions, which I think sometimes here in the Nordics we lack a bit, because things are quite, the culture is a bit risk aversive. So sometimes it's just a decision, okay, let's try, let's see if it works. And this voucher in experiment in France, it was a successful experiment, and I think now they're continuing it, and it will become probably not only experiment but kind of normal thing to do. So and that, by the way, that's what I like in circular economy, because there are many actions that are quite small but with a lot of impact. Eventually, to give a voucher for someone to go and repair a jacket, it's not, rocket science, it's not deep tech innovation, but something very, very small. And many aspects, we need to go back to how we used to do things. So my parents' generation, that's the way they did it. So maybe they didn't go to a seamstress because they knew how to do it by themselves. Right. But it's, it's just to revive the way we used to live as humans. Then the question is how you benefit from the new technology that exists now in order to make these things much more accessible and attractive also. It's also important.
Well, Alisa Mick, MiXi, it's been a very quick and interesting 30 minutes on Say Hi to the Future. I'm really happy to get the Nordic perspective, and I know you're speaking more from Helsinki and Finland, but we talked a lot about the Nordic perspective, because again, not the largest countries in the world, but much larger than some US states or Canadian provinces or whatnot. So very, very significant impact. And it's not just on, again, the circular economy, it's on education, it's on general care for one another, and especially the elderly. So I'm very happy you were able to join us. And if I may, I have one last question. One last question. So why you? Why do you have this passion? Was this like a click one day, or at some point in your life where you said, yeah, I have to become a leader in the circular economy and in helping manifest change or bring about change?
Well, I can start by saying that we all have a role in the circular economy because it's relevant for all of us. So it doesn't matter if you're like, from marketing or finance or seamstress, or so all of us are part of this thing somehow. When I describe my journey into circular economy, I remember the moment that I learned about circular economy, and it made so much sense. It was like, how aren't we all part of this? Because I used to say that you can argue if we have impact on the climate change, and I'm not going to into the discussions, because I know that there are people who think that the climate change is happening and it doesn't matter how we impact that. So that's one thing, but no one can argue with the fact that we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough materials, we don't have enough air, we don't have enough water. So of course it's related to the climate change, but it's very easy to understand that we have more and more people in this world. We don't have enough. So we need to use what we have the best way. Because my background is from working with startups. So when I understood that I can use my background from this world and combine it with the circular economy, so it's kind of, that's the part that I can play in this change. And when you work with entrepreneurs, the energy, of course, they have, and the passion, and the fact that they are motivated by the will to change the system as it is now. So it just, for me, it was like, okay, that's where I need to be.
Alisa, thank you so much once again for being on Say Hi to the Future today.
Thank you for being here. It was great speaking with you.